It's so small. Tiny tip of my pencil is so damn big on this drawing. Drawing a portrait the size of a penny makes you realise just how small a penny actually is. All throughout history, artists have pushed their skills to the very limits to show the world the best of their abilities. One of the ways they often do this is to go bigger and bigger and bigger, creating works on a grand scale that are so huge and detailed that they become impossible to ignore. But on the opposite side of the coin, some artists will go smaller and smaller, squeezing extreme levels of detail into artworks the size of a coin or a thumbnail, and in some cases making art so small you need a microscope to see the details. So in today's video I've decided to try and join them, by doing portraits that get smaller and smaller with each drawing until eventually I can do a drawing the size of a penny. So let's get into it. The first drawing I'm doing today is going to be 8cm by 6cm. This isn't much smaller than the usual mini sizes I do, but when it's this small, any drop in size can make a big difference. Plus I didn't want to start off too small because I'm determined to get at least one good drawing before delving into the really small sizes. So the fiddly details in the hair were kind of tricky. It doesn't help that this is my first time drawing in about a month, so I'm feeling a little rusty. But the tools that I use suddenly feel massive in comparison to what I'm working on. Even at their sharpest, my pencil tips felt way too big, and it was so tough to be precise with my mechanical eraser. I kept erasing too much, then having to redo, then erasing too much and having to redo. The hair on this drawing had me so worried about the smaller sizes. If I was struggling at this size, how would I cope with a drawing the size of a penny? I think the biggest benefit of doing tiny drawings is they're much quicker than the full-sized ones, which is so helpful in the era of social media platforms wanting people to upload more. But it's also really good at helping you improve as an artist. I found that after trying to squeeze so many tiny details into such a small space, I became much better at drawing details on bigger drawings. It felt like I was less restricted and I felt much more comfortable trying to do more with the bigger space I was working on. I've actually wanted to try this challenge for a long time. I did my first mini portrait as a way of doing some quick art on holiday when I was younger. It was a fun challenge and I soon realised it was a great way of making art while saving time, but I also became fascinated by seeing what I could achieve in such a small space. It's not just about the challenge of squeezing details into such a small drawing, but the challenge of figuring out which details needed to be there and which details I could leave out without damaging the overall look of the image. I'd see people online going smaller and smaller, seeing how they adapt their tools for their work, and it always led to the question of how small could I actually go? I tried to pick a somewhat detailed image for this drawing so that I can maybe cheat a little bit later on by going for simpler portraits for the smaller sizes. But the skin texture on this one was pretty simple. A couple of finer details, but nothing too small just yet. The eyes actually happened surprisingly quickly. I think I just got lucky. They just sort of came out right first time and I didn't really have to do much alteration to them. It doesn't always happen, but it's nice when it does. The details on the clothes were a little bit tricky, but it was mostly hidden up by dark shading, so it wasn't that bad. All in all, aside from the hair, this drawing wasn't really that difficult. Once I got into the swing of things, it all went pretty smoothly, so it was a nice one to start with. I just worked my way through, enjoying the process, knowing that the following drawings were not going to be as relaxing. And then to finish off, we've got the last bits of hair, last bits of clothing, and the background. And after just under 18.5 hours, we've got our first super mini portrait. My smallest drawing ever, and I like it. I'm really pleased with how this turned out. But I know this isn't exactly why we're here. So without further ado, let's go smaller. This one's going to be 4.5cm by 6cm. We're getting to the point where this could be really tricky, but then I guess that's what we're here for. So right off the bat, the outline for this drawing was an absolute nightmare. Mostly because the tip of my pencil was bigger than the lines I wanted to draw. So I had to use some very careful angles to make sure I used the absolute sharpest point of the tip. I think an interesting aspect of this challenge is how the tools I use change as it goes on. For instance, I've seen a lot of people who do smaller portraits who use sandpaper to sharpen their pencils down to the finest point they can possibly achieve. And some who even do their drawings while looking through a magnifying glass. There's a sculptor called Willard Wigan who specialises in tiny sculptures. He often does sculptures so small that they go in the eye of a needle, and a lot of the time he needs a microscope to see all the details, even going so far as to use one of his own eyelashes as a paintbrush. I've got a sharp point sharpener that's a huge help for this challenge, but as we get smaller and smaller, the pencil tip will eventually get too big for the portrait. Either that or I'd have to sharpen it after every stroke. So as I go on, I'll probably end up moving over to my mechanical pencil. And I'm glad I've got my blending stumps too. Details this small would be so hard to blend and smooth out if I was using a tissue like I used to. The face was pretty simple on this one as well. Smooth texture, not a lot of details, nothing too difficult. There was something about the eye on the left that looked a little bit off to me, but I couldn't figure out what it was. I tried fiddling with it to see if I could improve it, but in the end I thought it didn't really damage the image that much. It still looks like her, so I left it as it was. I tell you what though, these smaller drawings are great for conserving pencils. At this rate I could do 1,000 portraits with one pack. I should do more of these. The hair was pretty simple, just a lot of dark black, then add in some simple highlight details. I couldn't always get the lines as thin as I wanted, but it wasn't too bad. Like I said earlier, I intentionally went with a simpler and easier image because I didn't want to push myself too far into the deep end as these drawings got smaller and smaller. If I do more like this in the future, I might put more of a focus into seeing how detailed I can get them, but for now I think the drop in the size was enough of a challenge for me. So I worked my way through, finishing up the last bits of the hair in the background, and then after 7 hours and 40 minutes, we're done. All in all, this drawing wasn't as tricky as I thought it would be. The outline took a lot of focus, as did some of the details, but I specifically went for an image that didn't have much in the way of visible skin texture, and was a pretty simple image all around. And other than the smaller areas like the mouth and eyes where I sort of skimped on the details and really just did the bare minimum, it wasn't that bad. I'm really pleased with how this went. But now, we must reach our finale. We've had our practice runs, we've shrunken our artworks. Honestly, I'm kind of stalling because I thought there'd be more time for drawings to help me practice, but nope, we're here already. At 2 cm by 2 cm, the size of a penny, it is time. And for this drawing I decided to pay tribute to the artists who went the opposite route in all of this. The artists who go bigger and bigger until the world has no choice but to pay attention. I'm going to be drawing the Statue of Liberty. Or at least I'm going to be drawing the head of the Statue of Liberty. So I'm switching over to my mechanical pencil for this one. The grid squares are 1mm by 1mm, so even when using my mechanical pencil, the tip was so big in comparison to the squares that getting a details accurate on the grid was really tricky. I skipped some of the smallest details, focused on the main parts, and tried to make sure I got the general vibe, shape and positioning of things as good as I could. And soon enough, we're ready for the potential nightmare that is about to follow. I start with a background, because it's nice and simple and will give me good context for the tones for the rest of the drawing. This bit was relatively easy, I only slightly went over the lines and my mechanical eraser helped clean that up. I ended up using my dirty blending stumps for a lot of the shades. I found it easier than trying to draw with a pencil in such small spaces. With a blending stump that already has graphite on it, I can easily brush over the different areas and give myself a nice basic foundation without having to worry about visible pencil strokes or digging into the paper too much. Then I can either darken it with pencils or lighten it with my eraser. Then for the darker, more precise details like the eyes, nose and shadow areas, it was just about being incredibly careful. Like I said before, I wasn't as focused on getting all the tones as accurate as possible here, I just wanted to make sure everything was in the right ballpark. The correct placement of the details was a much bigger focus for me. So long as everything was in the right place, I knew I had a chance. The hardest part about the face was probably the mouth. I skipped most of the detail and really just tried to give the basic shape of the lips, but the eye on the right was tricky as well. Trying to get the dark areas where I needed them while also getting the right shape that I needed on the highlight for the eye took me a few attempts. And the fine lines in the hair were tough to get right. I went with the same method as I did with the mouth, keep it simple and if in doubt, underdo it rather than overdo it. I knew it wouldn't be a problem as long as it wasn't distractingly bad. All in all, the shading part wasn't as hard as I thought it would be. I imagine a lot of that was because I avoided the fiddliest of details. Like I mentioned earlier, one of the interesting parts in all of this is figuring out which details are necessary to keep the quality of the drawing and which ones can be left out without it being too noticeable. I feel like most people wouldn't notice that the details on the ears were a little underdone, and that I left out a few of the marks on the face. The focus is really on the size of the drawing and the overall look. I guess the hope is that if you get everything in the right place and pick out the right details to focus on, you can trick the viewer's eye into thinking nothing's missing. Or maybe that's just my excuse for laziness. Either way, it works for me. This was tricky in a couple of places, but it was nowhere near as hard as I thought it would be. Especially because the shading only took me about an hour and a half, so there wasn't really any time to panic, because before I knew it, it was done. So here we have it, my grand finale, my tiny reveal, my most miniature of masterpieces, my drawing the size of a penny. This is the smallest drawing I've ever done, and it was a fascinating experience. I'd be interested in trying to do more like this. I could try going smaller, but honestly, without changing my tools and getting into the more specialised stuff, I think I'd have a tough time going much smaller than this. So what do you think? Will you be shrinking your artworks, or has this inspired you to make your work even bigger and prove your abilities on a larger scale? Let me know down in the comments. Thanks for watching, and remember to like and subscribe if you enjoyed. I'll see you in the next one.